All right, folks. Well, many of you heard of Live from Daryl's House, music presentation by Daryl Hall of Hall & Oates, but we're having, this is called Live from Hal's House. No singing and dancing, but plenty of rich history and education. And we have here to debut, live from Hal's House, Tom Moor, a historian, an instructor at Camp Constitution. He's giving a presentation on the Battle of Concord in Lexington. Tom, take it away.
Huzzah! Yes, and I am speaking today on behalf of Camp Constitution. CampConstitution.net is a family camp, and we meet once a year up in New Hampshire. This year it will be July what through what, Hal?
Sign's right behind you.
Yes, okay. And this year we are meeting July 2nd through 9th. We're having the 4th of July celebration up at camp, and we are going to reenact the signing of the Declaration of Independence. And one thing I find, got some other instructors here, is I learn a lot from going up to the camp. I take notes, and everyone else does too. It's a family camp. Parents, kids all come up together and have a great time. We do all the normal things you do at a summer camp, but we also go into depth about the American Revolution and our founding. Now, why do we do this? The reason you study the past is to be active right now, is to keep our Constitution right now, our way of life, our competitive American economy. And so I'm going to speak a little bit on the past today and how it relates to the things that we're working for today as patriots. And we have some of the top patriots from around the country to come and speak as guest speakers up at the camp. And that's CampConstitution.net. Please visit that, and also visit our YouTube channel. So, listen, my children, and you will hear of the midnight ride of Paul Revere. The year was 1775. Hardly a man is still alive who remembers that day and year. So are the words of Henry Wadsworth Longfellow, who actually wrote that poem on the eve of the Civil War, and he was basically rallying the cause together because America was falling apart again at that time. So, America. America was born, you know, we in New England think it was not born actually on the 4th of July. It was born on the 19th of April, 1775 on Lexington Green, when the first patriot blood was shed. So, when did this thing, the concept, this feeling of America really start? We really need to go back to the Pilgrims and the Puritans, and of course the Pilgrims were first, 1620 in Plymouth, and then 1629 some of my people came over with John Winthrop, Thomas Dudley, and they were on the Arabella, the ship Arabella, to Salem, Massachusetts. So what was it about these two separatist groups that founded America even back then? Well, if you look at those founding documents, certainly in Plymouth, the founding document was the Mayflower Compact, and the founding document, or the founding speech up in Salem, was Winthrop's City on a Hill. So basically what you're describing is, while the king is given mention, they're founding a new society based on the biblical era, you know, the time of Gideon, and the time of Judges, when the Jews were living in Israel and they did not have a king. And when they did go to have a king, God said, I don't agree with that. And they went against God by having a king. And this is in the book of Judges, and it's also cited by Thomas Paine in Common Sense. So once we got to the Revolutionary era, Thomas Paine goes back and says, this is your founding. God says we're not supposed to have kings. Right. Okay. So, now, what happened during those years? So you have these two documents, and you're basically talking about a direct relationship with God. You don't need a king in the middle. You don't need the middleman. That's only causing corruption. You want to have a direct relationship with God. And that was the way of these colonies for so many years. And with them, you started to have colonial government, you know, and I should say the Massachusetts Charter, which was different from the other colonies, we had the ability to elect our own governor. Yes, and we did. And John Winthrop, Thomas Dudley, a lot of those early governors, they served a one-year term and they were elected by the people. We went up to around 1690, we had a Governor Andros. There was a problem. He was an appointed governor by the crown, caused a mini revolution back then. We went back to having our own governors. And then in the 1730s, this is very important, we had the Great Awakening to the power, truth, and love of Jesus Christ. We came back to that very strongly, and there again it was a direct relationship with God. You need a direct relationship with Christ. And then this idea became, okay, do we really need, the adjunct is that, do we really need not only a hierarchical clergy as existed in England, or this congregational setup where everything is decentralized. And so that was, and one of the great speakers of that time was Reverend John Hancock, who is the grandfather of the signer John Hancock. And Reverend John Hancock was a great preacher of the Great Awakening. When we were in Camp Constitution, visited Lexington, we visited the tomb of Reverend John Hancock, and one of our reverends, Stephen Kraft, actually gave a very wonderful sermon from the grave. It's one of these flat table graves of Reverend John Hancock. So that is our historical underpinnings for this revolution. So in the 1750s we have the French and Indian War. Some Americans, we would call ourselves colonists, supported it, some did not. But then afterwards the British were like, well, you guys are going to pay for it, whether you wanted it or not, or whatever, and we're going to start to initiate taxes, stamp tax, tea tax, sugar tax, and there was also the Currency Act. We had our own currency, believe it or not. So we had our own colonial script, which worked very well in peacetime, did not work well in wartime when the British counterfeited it. That's another story. But there were a lot of different things. The era of laissez-faire ended. And it's sort of like, okay, we were doing things better on our own without the Crown, when the Crown left us alone. Now it's not leaving us alone. And eventually, the biggest globalist corporation of the time was the British East India Company. Very, very important in studying the American Revolution. The British East India Company, if you go to New England ports, old New England ports like Nantucket, like Boston, like Salem, you have an India Street. That is a reference to the British East India Company. So when you come to the Tea Party of 1773, basically this is a protest. Most people think, oh, those colonists, when they study the revolution, I've seen even today, they just, they had to pay a couple cents more for the tea, and that's why they had this revolution. Not really. The British East India Company, the Tea Act, gave them a total monopoly on the trade. And not only that, but then they didn't have to pay any duties. It was a globalist big company, and they paid no duties on their tea. They just dumped all their tea on America, and it was actually cheaper than some of the colonist tea. And I guess if you had a similar thing, it would be like the power to have a free and competitive economy, which America built. So if we did something today, and this is going on today, it would be a revolt against the TPP. We would go to one of those Chinese container ships in Los Angeles and dump all those cheap Chinese goods in the water. That's a good parallel. And the president that was elected now, he understands that. And it's interesting that in the meeting that he just had with the Chinese, not ambassador, but the premier, it was that time that he chose to launch those missiles. I believe that was just to show, that you have basically a new sheriff in town. But he's protesting the same type of globalism Trump is that we had back then. Exactly the same type of globalism. And so there was a pamphlet that went out that night, and it was done by somebody by the name of Rusticus, and this comes from, I believe, Thomas Hughes, a direct patriot of the Tea Party, and it said, "Beware the British East India Company," and it told what happened to India as being a colony over years and years, and people were starving. There was no free competition. And anybody that opposed the British East India Company, like John Hancock, what were they called? Smugglers. That's right. So this was a strangulation of our economy. It was definitely a strangulation of the port of Boston, which was closed. People were starving. There was disease. There was famine. There was already a cause for war coming into 1775. Paul Revere made an earlier ride, as Hal and I know, up to New Hampshire. War could have broken up then. This was to take some of the powder that was needed in the coming conflict. That powder was stored in Concord. So when we get to April 1775, they're coming out to get the powder, that gunpowder, in Concord, and they're also coming out to arrest two patriots, Sam Adams and John Hancock. and they were staying at the Hancock Clark House. This was owned by Reverend Clark at the time, but it was built by John Hancock's grandfather. Again, the Reverend, the Great Reverend of the Great Awakening. So you have all these things coming into play. And so when they came out that morning, of course, one if by land, okay, let's go to the night before. One if by land, two if by sea. Of course, they were coming over the Charles River by water. So Revere goes out, Dawes goes out. Did they say, of course they did not say the British are coming, but it's interesting that a lot of people say, oh, they didn't say the British are coming because we were all British. No, 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 no. We were proud colonials with our separate history. If people that day in 1775 were proud British, there was a word for them. They were called Tories, and you had to watch out. So we were very different. We were colonials. We were proud colonials. We were not British. We did not have representation. We were being taxed without representation. We did not have representation in Parliament. And basically what Thomas Paine said later that year or early in 1776 is, this is such a corrupt Parliament with this globalist company, British East India. You don't want representation. You want to have your own. You've already got better representation in your New England town meetings. And Hal and I know that that's true today. These New England town meetings, which date back to colonial times, we have showed up and used these meetings to get rid of Agenda 21. So it's sort of like what was true in the past is true today. There are these very good local representation, and colonial governments were doing a much better job than if we had representation in London. We would lose every time. So this is interesting. So Revere comes, he gets to Lexington, he says the regulars out, the regular troops are coming, and then they're going on, he and Dawes move on to warn Concord. On the way, they meet Samuel Prescott. Now, this is interesting. So Samuel Prescott was just back from seeing his fiancée in Lexington. And, of course, they were chaperoned and so forth. So he is not actually an official rider that night. He just meets these other patriots, and they say, we're going to warn Concord. And he's just a patriot stepping up to the job. And he's in a good mood. You know, he's seen probably what was known as probably the prettiest girl in Lexington he was engaged to. He's in a good mood. He's, you know, they're like, let's go to Concord. This British contingent rides up, and they split up three ways. And as it turns out, Dawes doesn't get through. Paul Revere is arrested. This is in Lincoln Town, in between Lexington and Concord. And Prescott is the one that gets away, and Prescott is the one that actually warns Concord that they're coming. Sort of an interesting fact, and it's one of those beneficial things that happen in history. And so back in Lexington that night, so Jonas Clark is preaching from the Bible, is preaching back from those early books of the Bible and the Judges, and of course Pastor Garrett Lear, who's a friend of the camp, knows exactly those passages from when Israel did not have a king, right? Back when the days, God did not really mean for that was an act of disobedience for them to have a king. It's only supposed to be one king, earthly king, and that's Jesus. And so that was one of the cries at the time, right? They would say, I will have no king but King Jesus. Things you learn up at Camp Constitution from good pastors like Pastor Lear, who, by the way, grew up in Lexington, so he knows that. So British come up to Lexington. They're waiting for them, but they are just doing their duty. And it's interesting that, and this is a misconception that is affecting us in the Patriot community today. This, excuse me, the militia system had gone back all the way through the colonies, right? Yes, it went back all the way through the colonies, and so they were doing their duty. They weren't there to start a war. They were just standing their ground on the green, and a lot of the YouTube documentaries, a lot of the History Channel documentaries, and even in early America, like the Rude Bridge that spanned the flood, their flags to April's breeze unfurled. Here once embattled farmers stood and fired the shot heard round the world. They were more than farmers. They were part of a militia tradition that went back to the colonies. And they weren't just a bunch of farmers that picked up guns and were taking pot shots. No, 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 no. But the fact that that concept exists today in the Patriot community, it's just sort of like a lot of Patriots feel like, some of them feel like they can just do whatever they want. They can take the law into their own hands. And we don't teach that at Camp Constitution. The founders certainly were not doing that. They were going according to law and tradition, which had existed for that long. There were no police at the time. Regular troops are trained to do two things, kill people and break things. So this militia was just standing their ground. And John Parker, their leader, he said, you know, don't fire unless fired upon, but if they mean to have a war, you know, let America start here, or something to that effect. I'm not quite getting that perfect, but it's interesting that John Parker's gun hangs above the Senate in Massachusetts, one of the states that passes so much draconian gun control. So I hope they feel guilty when they look up and they see John Parker's gun. And that was definitely not what he was about. He was not about gun control. And they were told when the British came there and faced off, they backed off. They were not shooting. They were not doing that. And to a man, they said that they did not fire first. And these were Christian men taking depositions. Definitely, they did not fire first. The British were very nervous. They were 3 times the force. It was like 70 versus over 200 at that point, with more British on the way. Certainly, they did not mean to start the war there, but they were fired upon. Now, it's interesting, there was also some fire on the flank from the Buckman Tavern house. And we toured Buckman Tavern, and there's a door which has a bullet hole. So there was some firing on the flank that really is not that well documented. I can't really speak on it, but it's interesting that once things get rolling, you do have some people firing from the flanks. But in general, there were no trees at that time. They were cleared for farms. There were no trees to hide behind and shoot, right? So it was basically open, cleared land. And they went out to Concord, and by that time, Prescott had got through. And now you have different militias massing together to form an army and to face off at the bridge in Concord. And there was a face-off at the bridge, and that's when there was the first resistance in moving them and then back. And Hosmer, it was Captain Hosmer that stood at the bridge, and Buttrick, it was Buttrick's farm. And of course, the Reverend out there who had a view from his window was Reverend Emerson, the grandfather of
Ralph.
Yes, Ralph Waldo Emerson from that house, and he actually died at Fort Ticonderoga. He was a great patriot during that war. He watched the opening shots at Concord. So from Concord, they were battled back along the battle road. One of my ancestors fought in Lincoln around the Hartwell Tavern, where we visited Camp Constitution. There was a lot of really bloody fighting, but these weren't random farmers taking pot shots. They were fighting in an organized way, according to the tradition that had been around for 150 years. And so, this was our war for independence. A lot of people don't even like the term revolution, because some people think it reminds us of the French Revolution, which was all planned by Illuminists. So ours was not like that. It was very godly. And by the time we fought them back, all the way back to Boston, basically, at that time, they were penned into Boston, and then a couple months later, you have militias from 3 states, from New Hampshire, from Connecticut and Massachusetts, fighting at Bunker Hill, which is the first really pitched battle, and which we did very well. If we hadn't run out of powder, we would have held that hill. So that is sort of the picture of the early days of the American Revolution. And Paul Revere's ride still resonates a lot. It resonates with me, of course. I wear this hat. I did a podcast that's interesting in the north end of Boston, and the kids, this is right in the north end, near, 2 blocks away on Margaret Street, 2 blocks away from Paul Revere's house. Kids would walk by and say, "Look, Mommy, look at the pirate." So even here in New England, the patriotic history is not taught anymore, but you will get that patriotic history. Camp Constitution, campconstitution.net, and please look into it, and hopefully we'll see you this summer. Thank you.